My name is Zev Trachtenberg. I teach at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma. I'm in the philosophy department there. We're at the House of World Culture in Berlin, Germany, and we're here for I am a participant in the Anthropocene campus, which is the culmination of a 2-year program sponsored by HKV here that has consisted of a variety of programs and also exhibits on the topic of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene campus is an effort to bring together scholars and younger scholars from across the world to talk about the Anthropocene idea from a variety of different disciplinary perspectives, but around certain themes or topics, and to look at some readings and other kinds of educational materials to try to think of ways to help develop a kind of a curriculum that will allow people to gain greater understanding of this idea. The first session that I attended was called Modeling Wicked Problems. And the idea behind that was to give the participants an opportunity to explore the use of a quantitative model. It's called the Global System Simulator, both to get a handle on how models work and in particular to understand the sort of the hidden assumptions or to unpack the model a little bit and see how it actually works. And then to deploy the model to observe how very complex systems like the Earth system are subject to feedbacks and time lags and very unexpected results, so that you might change one parameter in the model and get a very unexpected kind of result. So this model in particular is set up to display, as they call them, tensions across a couple of different domains. So one is the population tension, or it has to do with the population tension, but it's more precise than that. It's the gap, or the potential gap, between the number of people who are needed in the labor force and the number of people who are available in the labor force. So if population is too small, for example, there won't be enough workers to do what has to be done in the economy. And so you manipulate different parameters in order to try and resolve these tensions and bring them together. And the object of the seminar was to, in effect, display how that can be difficult, but also in the effort, or I guess it's difficult because in the effort to try and correct one problem, like lowering fertility, for example, in order to bring the population down, it might have some other result, which is that it sends some other economic factor into tension as well. So the idea was to try and balance these tensions and then reflect on the combinations of things that one did in order to make that go. But the real value of the session, I think, was not in the solutions that anybody found, because the model is really quite simple, but rather in the experience of modeling. So I was saying to people, it's kind of like we weren't modeling, we were modeling. We were sort of having the experience of trying to sort of make different factors in a complex system work together, with the idea that, well, you know, if we were going to really model, if we went out and really tried to model, there would be sort of an order of magnitude more complexity involved. So that was the first one that I did. That was led by Pablo Jensen and Paul Edwards and Miriam Diamond. The second one that I'm in the middle of now is called Valuing Nature. And the idea behind this seminar is, well, I'm pausing because the agenda has kind of shifted actually as it's gone forward. But the core question is to subject to a kind of examination and maybe some criticism, maybe a lot of criticism, the idea that things that we value in nature or the value of what we value in nature can be measured in economic terms, can be, that a price can be put on natural features, natural services, for example. The idea being, of course, that allows for them to enter into, or consideration of natural values, to enter into policy debates in a way that are recognizable, since so many policy debates take place in a kind of economic frame. I think it's fair to say that, that this was a kind of contentious undertaking in this seminar. There was a lot of discussion of the enterprise itself, and what that debate about the project led me to think of is that what the underlying issue that we were really trying to think about there is not the sort of intellectual exercise of trying to come up with a number that we can attach to some natural service or another. Although, by the way, I should say there was a fascinating presentation on natural capital accounting systems that are being worked up, and I found that really fascinating. But I think the underlying question that this seminar was really inviting us to explore was, what's the basis for choice when we are making decisions that are going to bear on environmental factors? And so the promise, or perhaps some would say false promise, but at least the aspiration, I think, for ecological economics is that it provides a system for making decisions with respect to environmental matters that brings into the decision process considerations of what nature does, or how nature operates, and in particular how it benefits human beings. So we're right in the middle of that seminar now, and I don't quite know where the discussions are going to go, but that's I think the real core of things for me in that one. The third seminar that I'll be attending in a couple days is called Anthropogenic Landscapes. And it's really that one that brought me here, in a sense. I mean, I'm tremendously interested in that, and is in a sense the topic of my research now. And I was acquainted with one of the instructors for that seminar, a scholar named Earl Ellis, who teaches at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And so Ellis is famous for coining a term, the term being anthrome. So what he did was adapt the ecological notion of a biome, which is a kind of a landscape scale assemblage of, I guess, topographical features or underlay them, but types of plants and other organisms that are found together. So biome is that. So like rangeland, for example, is a biome. So it's probably fair to say that at least until pretty recently, ecologists have categorized the biomes in terms of, so to speak, natural biomes, wild biomes, as if human beings weren't intrinsically part of the landscape. And what Ellis has done, and I can't remember the name of his colleague with whom he published some of this work, but what Ellis has done is re-examined the entire globe, actually, and recategorized landscape units in terms of what he calls anthromes, which are biomes that have been affected by human activity. So cities, of course, would be one, but then there are sort of less intense urban areas, and then agricultural areas like pasture land. Rangeland is one of the anthromes that Ellis talks about. But the thing about rangeland is that it's not wild, it's occupied, maybe sparsely occupied, but the constitution of rangeland is determined to a large extent by the human agricultural pastoral practices that are carried out on it. So this seminar is going to be examining the idea of this kind of landscape, anthropogenic landscapes, landscapes that have been fashioned to a large extent by human activity. And we're going to be using a case study here in Berlin of an area in the, I think it's the Lichtenberg district, which is an old, a site of an old graphite factory, which I take it has substantially been removed at this point. But some of the old buildings have been occupied by a Vietnamese market. I believe it's one of the largest Vietnamese communities outside of Vietnam. And so there's a kind of reuse of this area in this new fashion. So my understanding is that we're going to take a field trip and go investigate this site and try to think about it in the terms that they'll offer us. So those are the 3 seminars that I'm attending here, and then there's a kind of wrap-up session at the end, and I've been invited to participate in that by giving a very brief sort of summary of what I've gleaned from my participation here of kind of ethical considerations. You know, what are the ethical ideas that people have brought forward in the seminars that I've attended, and really as valuable, and they're invaluable, the seminars are invaluable, but even more, not even more valuable, but as valuable, very valuable, are the informal interactions that we've had at dinner or back in the hotel at breakfast, or just, you know, the kind of social component here has been just spectacular. And so I'm supposed to just report back, I guess, on the extent to which ethical considerations have entered into our discussions, and sort of use that to spark a kind of roundup summary discussion at the very end. So that's my participation here. I want to talk a little bit about my research and how that led me to participate in this event here, the Anthropocene campus. So there's a kind of general response to that that doesn't really have to do with the substance of my research so much, but more the kind of research that I like to do, which is I have a very interdisciplinary interest and have done for a long time. And I think as soon as I became interested in the environment, I realized that you know, you can't really talk about the environment from a single disciplinary frame. I mean, you have to really have a big conversation with lots of participants. And so I was fortunate at my university in Oklahoma to find some colleagues early on who had a similar point of view, and we developed a small-scale kind of interdisciplinary program on environmental questions. So I was involved with that for quite a while. And that led me actually to participate in some research endeavors that were very interdisciplinary, involving social scientists, political scientists, and economists, and some physical scientists like hydrology people, and some agronomists and agricultural scientists, as well as I think I was the only humanities person on that team. And so really it's been sort of very much part of my intellectual orientation to participate in interdisciplinary efforts. And I'm always on the alert for interdisciplinary opportunities. So when I heard about this campus and the way it was set up, I just thought, this is fantastic. I want very much to be part of this, and I was quite fortunate that I was able to participate. It's really been tremendous. And part of what's been so tremendous about it is meeting people from such a host of backgrounds, from, you know, the very noted, you know, climate scientists, like people like Will Steffen, but also people in the humanities, people in social science. I was working with someone who's an agricultural economist today in my group, and there are anthropologists here. So there's really a whole host of people of that background. So that interdisciplinary piece is something that's very, very important to me. I like that a lot. But as to the specifics of my own research and how the substance of it brought me to the Anthropocene, the story is this, really. I guess I Well, really, I guess I can take it back to the time of my dissertation research when I was in graduate school. And I ended up writing about Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who the more I read and the more I learned about, the more compelling he became, and he sort of, in a sense, got under my skin, and I think to a fault I see everything through the lens of Rousseau. But I think he's that powerful a thinker, and the others in the Rousseau community, the group of us who focus on Rousseau, feel the same way, is that he really saw very deeply. So I finished my dissertation and it came out, and I was looking around for another project, where I was going to go. And the thing that I ended up focusing on in the dissertation work was on the collective action problem and how Rousseau has answers for the collective action problem. How do you get people to coordinate their activities in political life to have a successful political society? And so I was, in a sense, looking around for cases that would display interesting collective action problems in our own experience. And I guess because of my own just personal interest in and commitment to environmental questions, which I had not really thought of in an academic sense prior to that. It was just a sort of a personal commitment. I thought, oh, well, maybe environmental matters would be a good kind of test case for me to look at. And so that's what I took on to do. So I was helping get this interdisciplinary program going, but at the same time I was thinking about how can I apply Rousseau to these questions. So that was always in my mind. However, as I was just thinking about environmental problems in a general kind of way, a certain issue kept coming back to me, and that was, and I don't even remember the full source of this, but I think it might have been due to a book by, I think it's W.G. Hoskins, who was an English scholar in the middle of the 20th century, who wrote a famous book called The Making of the English Landscape. And Hoskins demonstrated that many features of the land that were just sort of not really taken note of, or kind of taken for granted, and perhaps even taken as natural, as part of the background, endowment of the land, were in fact constructions of human beings, earlier inhabitants of the land. And this is something, I think, which is not big news to Europeans who occupy a landscape that has been inhabited for millennia. But especially for Americans, I think that's a kind of a revelation, because we're so wedded to what has been called, as I'm sure you know, the wilderness myth, which is something that is still captures the American imagination. And so, our national parks are supposed to be examples of the great pristine wilderness, the virgin wilderness. It's where, where we can encounter the divine, in an unmediated way. So I think I always, participated, just in virtue of my upbringing in American culture. I'd always sort of participated in that myth. And so to learn about this way of looking at the land and to see it really as an historical product, and not just, the buildings, but the topographical features themselves, was a very powerful moment for me. And that stuck with me. And, the more I learned about about the workings of ecosystems and features, even in Oklahoma where I was living, things that, more and more, things that I kind of reflexively thought of as natural, I was learning, well, no, these are the product of human activity, typically indigenous activity, for example, fires set by Native Americans for hunting practices and so on. So as I got more and more involved in the thinking about the environment, I really had that notion in my mind. So I was thinking about that, and at the same time thinking, well, I know all this stuff about Rousseau, why don't I go back and take a look at Rousseau and see what he has to say, in particular because Rousseau is sometimes taken to be a kind of source figure for environmentalism, because the caricature of Rousseau is the person who loves to walk in the woods, and the advocate of the noble savage, and the sort of return to nature. And there are all these cliches about Rousseau, which are not entirely false, but they're certainly only partially true. So I went back to Rousseau, thinking, oh, I'll find this kind of expression of the wilderness ethic in Rousseau. But lo and behold, I found something very, very different and quite unexpected. Although on reflection, I shouldn't have been surprised, but it was quite unexpected for me. So on the one hand, it's true that there are these moments that Rousseau seems to go out into the woods, and the Rêve de la Promeneur Solitaire, pardon my French, as they say, the Dreams of the Solitary Walker, are filled with these accounts of Rousseau going out into the woods and sort of communing with nature in a way, and so on. And there are other passages in the Confessions and in other places, in some of the letters in Julie, where you do get this presentation of almost always an individual, him, or one of his stand-ins, Samprou. You get a representation of an individual going out into the woods. But almost always, those moments are moments where this individual is plunged into the depths of a kind of alienation prompted by his experience in society, in a very, alienating, corrupt society. And he's going out into nature in order to recuperate something of his self. And in fact, Rousseau is, I think, quite clear, and I don't want to get into the text, but he's quite clear that what you go to find when you go out into nature is not anything about nature, it's yourself, your pure self, the self that's unalienated, the self that's the self de amour de soi-même, pas l'amour propre. That's what you're trying to escape by going into nature. So nature is really not an end in that project. It's very much a kind of an instrument for self, almost a therapeutic project for healing the wounds of social alienation. And in this respect, Rousseau is kind of very much in the convention of the pastoral. And scholars have studied this moment in Rousseau quite a bit. So this was not totally surprising, but it certainly works against the idea of Rousseau as some advocate for the wilderness. I mean, I think Rousseau would not be someone who could be recruited for the wilderness ethic. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, as I started to read more of his work, and I'm a political philosopher, so in my book on Rousseau, I talk more about the social contract, really, and also the letter to D'Alembert on Geneva, which is very political work. As I started to look more carefully at what he says in his political works, there's a very different kind of human nature interaction. And first of all, that interaction is typically social. It's by the group of people, the community. And it's not it definitively not the same character as the sort of the pastoral sort that I described before, which is just passing through nature without any physical engagement with it. Maybe he'll lie down, or Rousseau was a famous botanist, and so or botanizer, I should say, although he was systematic about it and somewhat scientific. So he would pluck a flower here and there, but there's nothing like in that mode, he's not making use in a physical way of nature, and he even disparages it at times. On the other hand, in the political writings, he's completely engaged in talking about the landscape as I'll use a word that I perhaps will use more in our conversation. Landscape is habitat. It's the home of the community that are living there. And I'm going to use a word advisedly. You might say that he looks at it really very much as a kind of resource base. Now, he's not talking about it in the kind of, precise economic terms that we might use now, but he's absolutely seeing the landscape as the source of the means of subsistence for the human occupants who live there. So that was a bit of a surprise to begin with, and I saw, well, there's a real difference there. But then as I read further, and let me just say that there's a very much a kind of project of Republican habitation that I think is discernible in Rousseau, perhaps in lesser known texts, and I'm thinking in particular of the Constitutional Project for Corsica, which is, you know, I don't want to say a secondary work, it's a very important work as a document of the kind of application of his theoretical views that he expresses in Social Contract. So in Corsica, he describes this kind of Republican vision for the political life, but it's one which is very much engaged in making use of that landscape in a very active way. I can't remember the quotes now, but he's quite explicit about that. Well then, I went back and reread the second discourse with some care, I hope, and noticed the following. The second discourse famously is a story of the emergence of human beings as a social species. So he tells a kind of fable, really, in which human beings begin as a completely solitary species, wandering around in the primeval forest, not even in pairs, let alone groups. And so that's in the first part of the discourse. In the second part of the discourse, he talks about, well, how do we get from there to here, to modern society, where we're obviously highly socialized? And his account, he tells the account of this sort of slow development of the human species, or it's not really a biological development because he takes organic evolution really as given, but he sort of says, okay, so how did human beings go from a mode of life which is completely solitary to a mode of life which is totally social and indeed urban? And he tells the story in a way that, as people have noticed for centuries, or since the book came out, not quite 3 centuries, but for a long time, people have noticed that the difference is the increasing intensity of interaction that human beings have with one another. And so as human beings come to have more and more interaction with each other, they come to see themselves in others' eyes. That's the amor proprio phenomenon. And they come to depend on others for their own good sense of self. And this is the root of alienation in Rousseau, and the reason people are, horrible to each other, and why they, try to excel, and it's the source of competitiveness and ultimately of extravagant pursuit of luxury goods in order not so much for the value themselves of the goods themselves, but for their, what people would say now, their positional value, the fact that they make you feel better, feel more superior than another person. So this is all very familiar in the accounts of Rousseau, or the reading of the second discourse. But what I noticed, and I think this was a revelation to me, and to be honest, very few other scholars of Rousseau, I think, have really noticed this, is that as he tells the story of human beings becoming more social and coming into closer contact with each other, the key moves that sort of initiate the cognitive development that allow that to happen are moments when human beings manipulate the environment. So they begin, the earliest stage is sort of, the sort of degree zero person of the savage of part 1 of the second discourse is, doesn't even use a tool. He's just uses his hands and his legs to get around. So doesn't wear clothes. I mean, there's no augmentation of the human organism. What happens in the second discourse early on, the first step that human beings take is to pick up a rock and use it to, as a tool in hunting, or pick up a stick and use it as a tool in hunting. And then that sort of facilitates their mode of life, makes them more capable. It stimulates their cognitive ability, and then in virtue of that stimulation, they're able to do more, and they're able gradually to increase their capacity to manipulate the environment. So at a somewhat later stage, they begin to hunt more successfully, and then they begin to build dwellings or to, to really fashion a habitat for themselves. And then a little later than that, they begin to engage in agriculture and the kind of manipulations of the landscape that involves. At this point, it's very localized sort of garden patches around the huts and so on. And this is a very slow process. It takes a long, long time. But at a certain point, they kind of, in virtue of observation, begin to learn how to manipulate other features of the environment, like metals that they see coagulating out of volcanoes or something. And so they begin to be able to fashion tools out of metal, and that makes the agricultural process go better. And then because agriculture is improving, there's a greater surplus and they can invest more in technology development. And all of a sudden there's a modern industrial economy with the division of labor. And this accompanies and is really well, it's not the condition of, it's in a recursive relationship with both the cognitive and the social development that are the marks of modern social life. So what I want to add to the conventional account of Rousseau is this environmental piece, namely that we've always known that Rousseau pairs social development and cognitive development, but what I wanted to say is there's a triad there. So it's not just social development and cognitive development, it's the development of the capacity to manipulate the environment. That's an essential part of this developmental story that he's talking about. And the conclusion of it, in effect, in the second discourse, I don't have the text, so I'll not get it right, but he talks about wide-scale landscape transformation. So he talks about vast forests being converted to smiling fields. In other words, it's the deforestation of Europe to produce agriculture. So there's this environmental background in Rousseau that I think is under-recognized, underappreciated, and that is really the source of my, the kind of the root of my interest here. Because I think really what Rousseau is describing is, and I'm a little flippant in saying this, but is a kind of proto-version of the Anthropocene. Now, it's not the geological Anthropocene, which Rousseau, I think that thought was not available. The geological Anthropocene, I don't believe was available as a thought to Rousseau. But the Earl Ellis's used planet idea of the anthromes, that's Rousseau's idea. I mean, I think Rousseau is the one who really puts that on the table. There are some anticipations of it in antiquity, in particular in Lucretius, but I think it's Rousseau who really puts that idea on the table. And to be perfectly honest, I think Marx, in his accounts of nature as a human product, I think owes quite a bit to Rousseau. I haven't done my homework and studied the precise moment of transition or transmission, I should say. But I have a deep intuition that the Marxist idea is very much related to the Rousseauian idea. So that's really the basis of my interest in the Anthropocene. More sort of operationally speaking, I had this perception and I thought, okay, I need to learn a lot more about human transformation of landscape. I had leave a while ago and had an opportunity to do some reading, and I discovered this Anthropocene idea. And I realized, well, this is sort of writ at a planetary scale with implications for, it's connected to deep time and geological processes and at a vastly wider scale than Rousseau would have imagined. But it's Rousseau's idea. I'm not saying he owns the idea, but it's an idea that we can see in Rousseau, namely that human beings operate by modifying their environment. That's not new. I mean, that's not a kind of recent, a recent addition to the human repertoire. That's at the core of the human repertoire. In fact, it's that by which human beings made themselves human. So I really see the Anthropocene as a kind of, a moment writ large of this deeply human characteristic. So that's why I'm here. Well, that's a big question, and I think it does a couple of different things. Along two axes. I think in a practical way, it opens up the question of making political institutions it's even more urgent that political institutions be responsive to global phenomena, to global scale phenomena. And climate change has introduced us to that. Well, really, in many ways, the UN introduced us to that. I think the atomic weapons introduced us to that. But the Anthropocene brings with it, the whole range of challenges to the planet, not just climate change, but all the other ones that go along with the Anthropocene idea. So there's a very pragmatic institutional question that the Anthropocene raises. And I have nothing interesting to say about that, I'm afraid. This is not something I feel expert about at all. On the other hand, I think there's a more sort of conceptual question about what the object of political life is. And again, going back to Rousseau as a model for this, I think what he describes at a kind of small scale, as I mentioned with Corsica and the idea of republican habitation, that's a small scale phenomenon. But I think it provides a model for the sort of the purpose, the end of political life. And I think the end of political life is to create the conditions of good life. And the conditions of good life have to be understood in environmental terms. So, Aristotle talks about the kind of structures of the city that allow for the development of virtue. And Aristotle had environmental interests when it comes to that. But I think Rousseau is very, very conscious about that because he sees that part of the human enterprise is this interaction, this very intense interaction with the physical environment. So I think he sees that is essential to human activity. And what that activity is about is the creation of a habitat or the rendering of a space habitable. And I would like to conceive of political philosophy as aiming at habitability. In fact, I want to there's a famous line in John Rawls in The Theory of Justice where he says, justice is the first virtue of political institutions. So what he's saying is that what makes for a good political institution is that it conduces to justice in society. So I want to say what makes for a good political institution is that it conduces to habitability of the place that people live.
Thank you.
Well, I'm at an early stage of thinking this through. So what I have to say is perhaps very simple. To begin with, I want to really emphasize a kind of formal feature of habitability as I understand it, which is that it's a product. In other words, I don't think it's informative to look at a landscape, just a kind of naked landscape, so to speak, and say whether it's habitable or not. Landscapes are habitable to the extent that people make them habitable. And that process of rendering a landscape habitable through habitation of it is essentially a social process, and therefore it's a political process, the political level being the kind of adding the governance of it. However, and such is the same for all creatures. I'm convinced of that. The difference is, and this is an Aristotelian idea, is that human beings organize themselves, as Aristotle likes to say, around ideals of the good life. And so habitability is not an organic notion. That is to say, it doesn't have to do with the supply of a certain number of nutrients or calories or a certain standard of clean water or a certain standard of clean air. Those are obviously, it goes without saying, those are conditions of life and are contributors to habitability. But that's not what habitability in the human sense means, because habitation is a cultural enterprise. So people inhabit a land in a way that they inhabit it as a group, as a culture. So there are cultural norms and culturally shaped interactions with the land, cultural demands on the land for this kind of product or that kind of product, or this kind of activity or that kind of activity. And these can be not just sort of merely physical resource demands, but spiritual demands or aesthetic demands. So when I talk about habitability, I'm talking about the capacity of a landscape to provide for a form of life that is shared or aspired to by a culture, where the project of the culture, the project of the society, governed by its politics, is to bring that forth from the landscape. So that's just the kind of beginnings of how I think about it. I have a couple of other ideas, but that's the core of it, I think. I think there's a sense in which, on the one hand, we have to, in effect, give ourselves permission for the fact that we transform the landscape. I think that there's a tendency, that, and perhaps this is more in the American context, but you know, I detect this around, where there's a kind of guiltiness that we have, where, oh, we're sullying the landscape, or we're, you know, intervening in some, you know, natural process which is sacred because it's natural, or something like that. I just think that's a bad road to go down, because it's just necessary that we're going to do that. The attraction of that view, however, is that it seems to offer up some very clear normative guidelines, which is nature good, humans bad, humans enter into nature, that's bad, and so we know what's right and we know what's wrong. Now, if we take the step and say that humans are in nature, we're going to be transforming nature, that makes the moral situation, the normative situation, much more blurry, much harder to sort through. And I have to frankly acknowledge that. So I think what the habitability idea does is puts in question, puts on the agenda for discussion what counts as good living, what counts as a good life, where that question has to be understood as obviously having a social dimension because we live in societies. Questions of justice and, you know, fair treatment and all that are part of that, but it has to be understood as having an environmental dimension as well because we live in landscapes. So what counts as good habitation? So I think that subsumes the question of sustainability, frankly, because I think, you know, so the sustainability, discussions of sustainability have kind of foundered on what are we trying to sustain? Are we trying to sustain the condition of the landscape? No, we're trying to sustain, you know, the services that nature provides. Nobody really knows. There's a lot of contention. I think I have an answer for that. I think what we're trying to sustain is habitability. In other words, we're trying to sustain our capacity to have the life that we think is a good life. And that life, by the way, I think our standards of goodness, I think, very much involve our sense of the, you know, the condition of the landscape, not just as it sort of provides services to us, but as it flourishes on its own terms. So I think that's what the habitability notion can do. It sort of forces us into a frank and open conversation of what our norms are, instead of, you know, having this kind of sense of guilt about the fact that we're touching nature at all. Sure. So the question is, what's the relationship between the habitability idea that I'm investigating and the Gaia hypothesis of James Lovelock? I think that, you know, if I were to sort of expand it, it would look a lot like Gaia. I'm more sort of, I have a kind of, I confess, a sort of humanist bent, and I think that although I think that human beings are like all other forms of life in respect of niche construction, the difference of degree is pretty important, and that has to do, I think, with the fact that human niche construction capacities are promulgated through culture rather than through genetics. So the scale is vastly different. So I don't want to sort of put I don't want to put human beings on a par with the rest of creation here, not in the sense that I think that human beings are Lord and Master, or there's a divine grant or anything like that. But I think it's just simply unpersuasive not to recognize the profound asymmetries between human power and the power of other organisms. And I don't want to beat that horse too much, but there's more to be said there. But let's just say that. The other thing about the Gaia hypothesis that I personally resist is a kind of spiritual dimension to this, because frankly, I'm trying to be, if I may put it this way, as materialist as I can about this, or naturalistic about this as I can. And I think that the attraction of the niche construction idea to me is that it does place human beings in a natural setting even more firmly than otherwise. And I'm not certain how much Lovelock was committed to a kind of a spiritual dimension to Gaia, that there's a kind of planetary consciousness or something like that. That I'm less friendly towards, I have to say. But to the extent that the Gaia hypothesis represents the notion that life creates the conditions for its own existence, and that happens not just individual by individual, or not just species by species, but certainly community by community, and at a certain level, for certain organisms, there is a global community or global scale community. That was the case with the cyanobacteria. Then I think that's consistent with the direction I'm moving in. We have, I think, within humanity, or at least within Western culture, but maybe it's other cultures too, there's this apocalyptic opportunity, or an opportunity for apocalyptic thinking, and it comes out in periods like we know in the millennium and in the Y2K and all this kind of thing. And certainly since World War II and the bomb, and the recognition of environmental damages, this opportunity to think that we're confronting apocalypse is very, very available to us. And so it's very easy to fall into that. And I think that's a bad place to be. I think it's sort of politically, it's demobilizing. It enforces a kind of passivity and resignation. And even if it were true, those are bad attitudes to have, I think. So I think one has to resist that kind of pessimism that can, that we can fall into. I think one of the values of the habitability approach that I'm trying to develop is it's a life-affirming, positive approach. In other words, it calls us to create the conditions for a good life for ourselves. And what that means now, given the information that the scientists are presenting to us under the rubric of the Anthropocene, what that means now is, well, there are certain changes that are called upon, that we're called upon to make. There are certain recognitions about the impacts at a global scale of the style of life that we enjoy in the West. We've known this for a long time, but now it's being, intensified or emphasized by the scientific study. So we can face the necessity of making those changes with a positive goal in mind. In other words, we can think of it not as, punishment or something that we have to do to give up, but rather an opportunity to create a kind of life that we think is a good life to live. But we have to understand that as something that is not going to take us out of the environment, but into a more creative engagement with it. We're going to have to be smarter about the way we transform the environment. We're not going to stop transforming the environment, but we have to be much more intelligent about the way that we do that. And that intelligence is not just in terms of what we can get out, although it is that, but it's also, we have to be much more mindful of the surroundings of that, of the externalities, as the economists would say. We have to really understand what flows from our interactions in the environment. And I think in the past, and certainly under conditions of modernity and so on, that part has not been appreciated as fully as it should be.